Okay, hello and welcome to Advanced Dice Making with TheIronSpine. Now, this video is actually a follow-on from my Dice Making Basics video, which you can see up on screen now and down in the description if you want to start there. But if you're interested in how I can achieve results like these, then keep watching. Okay, so the first thing that I needed to do for this project was to 3D model all the dice shapes, because I needed some masters that I could then cast molds of to make future sets of dice. The easiest way to do that was to 3D model them in Blender. So I started with all of the dice shapes, and then much like I did for the Tom Scar video, link in description, I created three-dimensional kind of extruded versions of the numbers, the skull, etc., and then used that as a tool, kind of cutting that shape out of the dice shapes, which gave us these nice little indents. So, after several hours of modelling and a lot of typing in angles, I had some STL files which were ready to be 3D printed. So I sent those off to a local printing shop and just had to wait for the results. So, as you can see here, I went off and picked up the dice and they're pretty well printed. There's a few little errors where some supports have been added which are kind of necessary for the 3D printing process, but they were very easy to remove and buff off. It took next to no time at all to get them smooth and ready for use. Okay, so now it's time for the sciencey bit, so if you're not interested in that, that's totally cool, just skip ahead, use the chapter markers down below and you can see me actually making the dice. For those of you that want a bit more of an in-depth explanation, I need to start by telling you guys how 3D printers work. So bear with me. Right, back in the 80s when they made this technology, they created a process called SLA. And basically the way that works is you have your resin and you shoot a laser at it, and where the laser hits the resin, that's where the resin cures, so you can harden it up in the places it needs to be hard and build a shape that way. Now, modern 3D printers are a little bit different. They use a process called SMLA, which is a bit more complicated, but you can get better, cleaner, more complex shapes. So in SMLA, what you have is you have a UV light shining upwards, and then above it you have a trough of your resin, and the UV light is what hardens up the resin. So obviously you don't want the whole lot to be cured at once. So interposed between the light and the trough, you have an LCD screen like you get in a mobile phone, and the LCD screen will turn on and off certain pixels to block the UV rays from hitting the resin, kind of like casting a shadow. So in that way you can control which areas of the resin harden up and which don't, and extrude a three-dimensional shape, kind of like building lots and lots of little slices on top of one another. So it's a lot faster and a lot more precise of a process. So why is this important? Well, the reason is the resin that you have to use if you're going to 3D print with SMLA. And that's because the resin that you use works by a process called radical chain polymerization. And that sounds really technical. It's not that difficult to understand. So in your bottle of resin that you use for your 3D printer, you have molecules called monomers, which are like the building blocks of plastics. They're the kind of molecule that can connect to one another to form a polymer. And you also have crosslinkers, which are another kind of building block of plastic that like to stick polymer chains together. But the third thing that's in there is what's called a photoinitiator, and that's the chemical that makes those other components, those other ingredients, want to stick together and form a plastic. So these photoinitiators, when the UV light hits them from the 3D printer, they split into what's called radicals. They're like little molecules that really want to react, and they stick to the monomers, the crosslinkers that are in the resin, and make them want to stick to one another. and as such you get these long polymer chains being formed and then sticking to one another and making a more dense lattice work, which turns the liquid into a solid. That's how you get the hard plastic. Now, why do we care? The reason is that most of these photo initiators nowadays are sulfur-based compounds. The problem arises when we want to use a platinum-based silicon to make the molds of our dice masters that we can then use to pour our own dice. Platinum-based silicon, which is the most common type on the market, doesn't like to cure when there's sulfur nearby. It doesn't react well. It can get what's called platinum poisoning. Now, you can get different kinds of silicon, tin-based silicons for example, but they're a lot harder to get hold of, they're usually more expensive, so we need to find a way around this problem. Now, there are products on the market that are designed to stop cure inhibition in platinum-based silicons. Things like Inhibit X that you can spray on and it's supposed to make it just solidify. However, they can be a bit hit and miss, and if you live in Europe, they're really goddamn expensive. So we need a way around this problem, and that's where this process comes in. Okay, so the next thing I needed to do was to prepare the dice to be molded. Now, to do this, I put them all under a UV light to make sure the resin was completely cured and to allow any other sort of particulates to gas off of them. I left them like this for a couple of days, turning occasionally, just to make sure they were all ready to be used. The next step was to wash the dice in isopropyl alcohol. Now, this was to make sure that there was no dust, no particulates, no little bits of other compounds that could foul the moulding compounds that I was going to use. Obviously, you do this in a well-ventilated area, wear a respirator, etc, etc, make sure you've got gloves on. IPA can make you a little bit dizzy, so I made sure to have the extractor fan on in this video. After I'd washed the dice and put the lid on the Tupperware to keep the fumes in, I left them for a few hours, occasionally giving them a little shake about, just to make sure that they were completely clean. Next up, it was time to prepare the dice for moulding, and I did this by using small pieces of bamboo skewer along with plastic shot glasses, which are perfect for this process. So I used hot glue to suspend the dice standing up on a small piece of bamboo skewer, which would allow not only a way for bubbles to get out, but a way for the resin to get in when I injected it with pipettes later. As you can see here, I mounted all the dice on small pieces of stick connected to a flat surface to remove any fouling of the numbers, etc. Remember that anything that you see inside that shot glass is going to be made of resin, so I had to keep it as small as possible to reduce wastage, to make my life easier when it came to trimming them afterwards. The next step was to prepare the silicone itself, and I used a 50-50 mix silicone. Like most silicones, it's platinum based, which is why we had to do the extra preparations with the isopropyl alcohol and the UV light first. Now, the moulding part of the process was relatively straightforward. All I had to do was obviously wear the safety equipment, as you can see, and make sure that everything was thoroughly mixed, because I needed to make sure that these silicone molds would set nice and hard. If you don't get it mixed properly, it's not going to cure properly, so I mixed it for a good 5 or 10 minutes, really made sure that it was activated. When it came to pouring, obviously I needed to be a little bit careful to not create any air pockets underneath the dice, specifically in the numbers as well that were facing downwards, because otherwise we'd have to make the molds again from scratch. Alright, so once all the silicone was poured, I then set the little shot glasses inside my pressure vessel because I wanted to really make sure that there would be no air bubbles. I didn't want to have to do this multiple times. Okay, so my pressure vessel is actually an industrial paint pot designed for spraying large quantities of paint. I've modified it slightly, so now it's just a pressure vessel. I'll show you how very soon. But right now you need to take note of the fact that there's an air diffuser on there, so when the air is pumped in, it will go to the sides rather than going straight down into the mix that I've got below, because that could cause air bubbles to form. Obviously we're going to be working with high pressure, so we need to make sure all these clamps are very secure, and the best way to do this is to finger tight them all and then apply another twist at the end to make sure that they're all secure. Okay, so this is my pressure vessel. Now what we have on top here is a simple ball valve which will allow me to lock the flow of air in or out of the cylinder. We have a pressure regulator valve which controls the flow, which is set to maximum and left open. We have a pressure gauge which is self-explanatory, and the all-important safety valve which will blow off any excess pressure if we get too high. Alright, so this is the compressor that we're actually going to be using to pressurize the pressure cylinder itself. Now we've got the pressure regulator valve here which controls the flow, the output pressure gauge and the gauge that displays the pressure inside the actual cylinder itself, the all-important stop-start and the release valve here, as well as the long tube that I've attached to one end, and you can see me now just tightening up the emergency release valve on the bottom there to make sure that it's ready to pop if it needs to, but it won't be letting pressure out unless there's an emergency. Now I'm going to connect the other end of the hose to the pressure cylinder itself with a little bit of faffing around. It only needs to be finger tight, the thread will definitely hold the levels of pressure we're going to be working with. And then finally I need to open the ball valve to allow the air in. Skadoosh. Okay, so here you can see me filling up the pressure cylinder using the compressor, and it's important to note here that when I modified this I did remove the downpipe that usually carries the paint out of the cylinder, and I capped up the hole using some plumbing pieces, specifically a stop cap, and I made sure it was sealed using some Loctite thread sealer, which you need to do if you're going to be working with high pressure, otherwise it will just leak out regardless. I was able to check that it was airtight by actually spraying on some soapy water and looking for bubbles to make sure it was ready and well rated for pressure before I continued. Also, this cylinder is actually rated for around 80 psi, and we're not going that high. We're going to between 3 and 3.5 megapascals, which if you live in America, Liberia or Burma and still use silly units, is about 45 psi. Next up, I had to wait for about 48 hours to make sure the silicone was fully cured so it wasn't tacky and there was no issues with mold release. And then I used a Stanley knife blade to make some incisions down the sides, being careful of the masters in the middle of course, to allow me to remove them without taking any of the detail with me. And then I was able to recover the masters ready for use again in future, and we've got some lovely clean molds. You can see that there's all the numbers and skulls inside there, nice and sharp. The next step was to prepare the molds and the resin that I'd be using to actually cast the dice. Now, this set was actually commissioned by a friend of mine for another friend of mine for his birthday, and his favourite colour is green. So the inspiration that I had for this was simply go crazy with shades of woodland colours. So I decided that I was going to go for this glassy look that is really hard to achieve, with swirls of green inside. In order to do this, I mixed up 2 different batches of resin, one with a very slight green tinge and one with a much more pronounced green tinge, using the food colourings that I commonly use when colouring resin because I think they work really, really well. Then it was a case of preparing the moulds themselves by making sure they were all perfectly lined up and secured with some masking tape to make sure they weren't going to pop apart when the resin was injected. Then I made sure that there were a couple of pipettes filling at all times because resin takes ages to be slurped up into a pipette and then injected, and I had to also make sure that there were no bubbles within the syringes, so you have to occasionally angle the cups that you're using, etc., to make sure that you don't get any imperfections. Following this, it was a case of injecting a large amount of the clearer resin before injecting smaller amounts of the more prominently coloured green resin to create this kind of plume effect that I was going for, gently squeezing some in and drawing the pipette out at the same time. And it was very, very important to always overfill these molds, because the pressure will cause the resin to occupy less space, but also we want to make sure that if there are any bubbles that are forced out, there will be resin to fill the gap. It's also very important when injecting resin into these molds to do it at an angle to keep the pipette kind of to one side of the entrance hole to allow for any air to escape, so that we don't artificially add any bubbles either. Once the resin was injected, of course, the next step was to put the molds back in the pressure pot, repressurize it back up to 3 and a bit megapascals, and then wait another 48 hours to make sure the resin was properly cured against the silicone molds. After that, I simply removed them as before, cracked them open, and you can see here the small pieces of excess plastic and little wings that are still attached to the dice. Next, it was simply a case of using some model clippers and a craft knife to very carefully shave these excess pieces of plastic away, and then began the very, very long procedure of sanding. Sanding is by far the longest and most tedious part about making dice, but if you do it right, it really yields some excellent results. So, I wet sanded every face of every die after having clipped off all the excess plastic with 1000 grit sandpaper. Then I repeated this process with 1200 grit sandpaper, and then 1500 grit sandpaper, and then 2000 grit sandpaper, and then 3000 grit sandpaper. You can imagine 30 seconds on every side of every die takes a while. But when it was done, I was able to allow the dice to dry and then use a small cocktail stick to remove any excess bits of plastic dust that had built up within the numbers and skull indents. Once that was complete, you could really see that they were beginning to take shape. So next up, it was time for polishing, and I used a polishing compound that was actually designed for polishing the plastic of headlights to remove fogginess. And again, that's 30 seconds on every side of every die as well. But when it's done, you can really see the difference. After the polishing, the only step that remained was to ink the dice, so I needed to paint in the numbers and the skull faces on every side. The way to do this is to just use model paints, and I like to use Citadel paints. I use them all the time for my miniatures, and I think they work pretty well. So, as with painting any miniature, I needed a fine detail brush and I needed a lot of control over the paint. So a small amount goes onto the palette, mixed with a small amount of water to thin it down and give a nice fine tip on the brush, and then it's a case of inking in every single number. And once that's done, leaving the dice to dry shows you the full effect of your hard work. All in all, I'm really pleased with how this set came out, and I hope that my friends are too. And Fray, if you're watching this, happy birthday mate, I hope you like them. If any of you watching are inspired to try working on dice yourself, do feel free to get in touch if you want to ask me any questions, and good luck with it. And if any of you are interested in commissioning me to make dice for you, you can contact me very easily via my website or via the links that you can see below. Thanks everyone very much for watching, happy crafting, and I'll see you in the next one.